Hey guys, my name's Joanne and I'm going to be summarizing Johnston's chapter 4 titled Seeing Yourself. He starts by learning to talk about ourselves, and he says that talking in first person is basically saying about who you are. Johnston argues that there's no evidence of a physical existence of a self, and this is a kind of talk that's simply part of our verbal repertoire. We learn to talk in first person as a way to talk about our public or overt behavior. Children learn to use I and other self-descriptive words the same way that they learn other verbal behavior through modeling, prompting, correcting, and reinforcing. When we talk about our past behavior, like saying, I had eggs for breakfast this morning, we're describing our overt behavior, and this is reinforced when a person, like my parents, asks what I had for breakfast, and then I have to remember and recall to that person the behavior that happened or what I had for breakfast. And it's basically describing a public event. Who do you think you are? Johnston answers that question with the fact that who we are is basically just a reflection of what our verbal communities teach us to respond about ourselves. Our verbal community creates the notion of a self, basically. On page 79, Johnston says, our self-descriptive repertoire is fully acquired by our verbal community. If we didn't have a verbal if we weren't part of a verbal community, then we wouldn't learn to have a sense of self-awareness or learn how to talk about ourselves. This is clear for babies who haven't learned any verbal repertoire and individuals with severe intellectual disabilities who have difficulties learning a verbal repertoire. Other people reinforce our self-descriptive behaviors because it's useful for them when we can discriminate our public and private behaviors. And this is why we only learn to observe what's relevant to our verbal communities. Okay, so when we attend to something, we're responding to it in some way. When someone sees something, like a bird outside, simply looking in the direction of the bird would not mean that they're actually aware of it. They would have to tack to show that they are aware of it by saying like, hey, I see a bird. We can only be aware of something if we can talk about it in some way, even if we just talk about it to ourselves in our head. When a person does something without any social occasion or anyone else present to witness that they're doing that, there's not enough evidence to prove that they're focused or are aware of how they are completing the task. For example, is when I'm driving alone, I drive to a location, and when I get to that destination, sometimes I ask myself, like, oh, how did I even get here? I wasn't really aware. I didn't recall any of the specific steps that I took in driving to that destination. And this is why people tend to look for some type of verbal verification to know that someone is attending to something. A limitation of our self-knowledge is that we usually are unaware of what we do or are doing, and then we cannot describe the variables influencing our behavior. Like driving, this is because competing demands for our attention from all the stimuli in the environment. And a reason for this weak self-knowledge is due to our learning history. The fact that our verbal community teaches us what to pay attention to, it leads to a misguiding of our attention and observations. The notion of consciousness and awareness are simply convenient ways that we learn to talk about our behavior. Johnston argues that we should abandon the idea of a mind so that we can be left with a physical science to consider how the environment controls our behavior. So senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching, they all involve both physical and behavioral components. When someone's seeing, our eyes are like cameras that capture every part of a scene, but we see only some things in that scene, only the things that we attend to that our learning history has taught us that are important. So we're taught to attend to certain things so that we don't become too overwhelmed by all the stimuli in our environment. An effect of this history is seeing or hearing things or events that aren't currently present. For example, picturing a person's face, even though that person is not right there in front of you, and recalling and hearing a song in your head, even though the song isn't playing. Uh, Another one is when you put a seashell by your ear, you tend to hear the ocean because of a conditioned hearing response. So when we see something, our visual system is what is doing the actual seeing, and we're just saying that we're like aware of the act of seeing that thing. When we pay attention to certain parts of a scene that we are seeing, it's a result of discrimination training. The differential consequences we receive when we see those things are what teach or reinforce us to see them. So, for example, driving. If I'm not the driver, I don't really pay attention to the road, so I'm not reinforced by being able to see where we're going and getting to that destination. An awareness of our behavior is uniquely human, Johnston argues. At birth, a baby is just like any other species who just responds to the visual world without actually seeing. But eventually, babies learn to respond to certain visual stimuli, like a bottle, because it's what's used to feed them, and they are able to label that object and then use more complex self-descriptive repertoire, like saying, "Oh, I can see the bottle." And when a dog barks at a squirrel, that's not clear enough evidence to show that they're engaging in the same behavior that like a child does when it says, "Hey, I see a squirrel." They would have to be able to learn to, in some way, say or show that they are seeing something. In page 89 to 90, Johnston says, other species merely respond to the world around them. But because of our verbal community, we learn to respond to the fact that we are engaged in what might be called sensory responding. So self-control. Since we can describe our private behavior or have self-descriptive abilities, that means that we can also control those private behaviors. And we manipulate the variables that are only functionally related to the behavior of our interests. In 1953, Skinner described some techniques of self-control. The first one is physical restraint. For example, I wear a sweater if I have like an itch on my arm so that the sweater can block me from itching myself on my arm. And then next is the change the stimuli. You know how some people hide their phones so that they don't send that text to their ex? And then manipulate deprivation conditions. When my coworkers and I had a eating competition for dinner, we skipped lunch to prepare for our endless shrimp competition. And the next is manipulate emotional variables. So when I see a sad commercial on TV, like those ASPCA commercials, I change the channel to avoid crying. Next is using aversive stimulation. I have a study partner in this class so that if I slack, she can yell at me, and her yelling at me is the aversive stimulation. And last is the use of drugs or other substances. My example is that I take Benadryl in order to get a better sleep at night. So self-reinforcement situations involve two behaviors. The first is behavior that's reinforced, and second is the individual's behavior of reinforcing that first behavior. So for example, if I run an extra mile today, I can treat myself to a burger or ice cream. And the key is that the notion of self-reinforcement depends on our ability to discriminate our own behavior. So I'd have to be able to discriminate the running the extra mile from any other less achievement, so that I would only allow myself to treat myself to the burger or ice cream only if I meet the criterion for reinforcement that was already important, which was running the extra mile. So if the target behavior of treating myself was sufficiently important, then the extra mile would acquire like a condition reinforcing property. So self-reinforcement is simply another form of ordinary reinforcement, basically, according to Johnston. So my discussion question is, provide an example of one of Skinner's techniques of self-control, listed on slide perception, awareness, attention, and consciousness. Considering the last time you used that technique, what was your level of awareness that you were engaging in that technique? Thanks, guys.